The classroom was quiet except for the scratching of pencils on paper and the occasional squeak of chalk on the blackboard. At the very back, in the corner seat next to the window, sat a boy with dark curly hair that fell over his eyes. This was Raj, 17 years old in a class of 16-year-olds. He kept his head down, shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make himself invisible. Raj had been held back a year ago after his world had fallen apart. His parents' sudden death in a terrible accident had turned everything upside down. After missing weeks of school and failing most of his classes, the school decided he needed to repeat 9th grade. What they didn't know was that school had become the least of his worries. Between taking care of his elderly grandmother and working evening shifts at the local grocery store, homework seemed pointless. The new math teacher, Mrs. Walsh, tapped her pointer against the board impatiently. She was in her mid-40s with glasses that constantly slid down her nose and a habit of sighing deeply whenever a student gave a wrong answer. This equation, she said, underlining it twice for emphasis, represents the foundation of what we'll be covering this semester. I expect everyone to master it. Her eyes swept across the room and landed on Raj, who wasn't looking at the board. Instead, his pen moved quickly across the corner of his notebook where he was writing something that definitely wasn't the assigned work. Mrs. Walsh had read his file before the semester started. Unmotivated, withdrawn, academically behind, the notes from previous teachers painted a clear picture. Just another problem student taking up space in her advanced class. She'd already decided he wouldn't last the semester. What Mrs. Walsh didn't see was what Raj was actually writing. Hidden beneath his arm, in the margins of his notebook, were equations far more complex than anything on her board. While she taught basic calculus, Raj was exploring advanced topics he taught himself from old textbooks he'd found at the library. Perhaps if you paid attention, Mrs. Walsh said loudly, causing several students to jump, you wouldn't be repeating this class. Raj looked up briefly, his dark eyes meeting hers for just a second before dropping back to his notebook. A few students snickered. This wasn't the first time he'd been singled out, and it wouldn't be the last. At lunch, Raj sat alone as usual. He pulled out a sandwich his grandmother had made him that morning, slightly squashed but wrapped carefully in wax paper with a small note that read, "Don't forget your greatness." It was something his father used to tell him. "Hey, mind if I sit?" Raj looked up to see a girl with glasses and a bright yellow backpack. This was Priya, probably the only person in school who bothered to talk to him. "Free country," Raj mumbled, sliding over the make room. "Walsh was pretty harsh today," Priya said, opening her lunchbox. "You okay?" Raj shrugged. "I'm used to it." "What were you writing anyway?" "I saw you scribbling like crazy." For a moment, Raj considered showing her the complex equations that helped him escape, the mathematical problems that made sense when nothing else did. But instead, he just shrugged again. Nothing important. That evening, Raj walked home slowly, backpack heavy with books he'd never open. His grandmother would be waiting, probably already starting dinner despite her arthritis. After dinner, he'd help her with her medication, then head to his 4-hour shift at the store. Homework would have to wait until midnight if he had any energy left. As he walked, his mind wandered back to Mrs. Walsh's equation. There was an elegant solution she hadn't mentioned, a shortcut that made the whole problem trivial. But explaining that would mean drawing attention to himself, and that was the last thing he wanted. Little did he know that in less than a week, Mrs. Walsh's attempt to embarrass him would change everything. The equation she would put on the board wasn't just going to be a test, it would be the moment his hidden abilities could no longer stay hidden. But for now, he was just Raj, the quiet kid in the back, the boy nobody really saw, the student everyone had given up on. And sometimes being invisible was exactly what he preferred. The morning bus was running late again. Raj checked his watch for the third time, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he stood at the corner. His grandmother had woken up with her arthritis flaring badly, and he'd spent extra time helping her with breakfast before rushing out the door. The night shift at the grocery store had kept him up until midnight, and his eyes felt heavy with lack of sleep. When the bus finally arrived, Raj grabbed a seat near the back, leaning his head against the cool window glass. He closed his eyes for just a moment, but jerked awake when the bus hit a pothole. He fumbled through his backpack, double-checking that he had finished the math homework. It wasn't his best work. He'd scribbled the answers without showing his steps, but at least it was done. The school hallways were nearly empty when he arrived. The late bell had already rung, and Rage hurried toward Mrs. Walsh's classroom, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. He paused outside the door, taking a deep breath before turning the handle. The entire class looked up as he entered. Mrs. Walsh stopped mid-sentence, her chalk still pressed against the blackboard. The silence felt heavy as Raj mumbled an apology and made his way to his seat. "How kind of you to join us, Raj," Mrs. Walsh said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We're all so grateful you could fit us into your busy schedule." A few students snickered. Raj slid into his chair, keeping his eyes down as he pulled out his notebook. The page on the board was filled with complex differential equations, much more advanced than what they'd been covering the previous week. He quickly realized they must have started new material yesterday, material he'd missed during his absence. "As I was saying," Mrs. Walsh continued, "these equations form the foundation of calculus applications in physics. Pay close attention because this will be on next week's test." Rage tried to focus, but the numbers and symbols blurred together as his tired mind struggled to keep up. Without yesterday's introduction, the concepts seemed disconnected. He began doodling in the margins of his notebook, not random scribbles, but his own version of the equations, rearranged in a way that made more sense to him. 40 minutes into the class, Mrs. Walsh assigned group work. Students pushed their desks together, chatting as they tackled the problems. No one moved toward Raj's desk. This was normal. He was used to working alone. He stared at the assignment, quickly seeing the pattern in the problems. These were simple for him, despite missing the introduction. He began solving them, using shortcuts he discovered on his own. "Having trouble, are we?" Raj looked up to find Mrs. Walsh standing over his desk, eyeing his paper. She must have noticed he wasn't showing his work the way she required. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "Really? Because it seems to me that you're not taking this seriously." She picked up his notebook, flipping through the pages with a frown. "What are these scribbles? This isn't how I taught you to approach these problems." The classroom had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now. "I have my own way of solving them," Raj said, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Walsh's eyebrows shot up. "Your own way? Well, isn't that special? I suppose 40 years of college and 12 years of teaching experience can't compare to your innovative approach." She turned to the board and erased her previous work. With quick, angry strokes, she wrote a new equation, one far more complex than anything they'd covered in class. It involved multiple variables and would typically be found in advanced college courses, not high school math. "Since you're so confident in your abilities," she said, holding out a piece of chalk, "why don't you show us your way of solving this?" The classroom fell completely silent. Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was going too far, even for Mrs. Walsh. Priya, sitting near the front, looked at Raj with worry in her eyes. Raj stared at the equation, a strange calm washing over him. For the first time in months, he felt something other than exhaustion and grief. He recognized the equation immediately. It was a type he'd explored during those long nights when sleep wouldn't come, when math was the only thing that quieted his thoughts. Slowly, he stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed it back. Every eye in the room followed him as he walked to the front of the class and took the chalk from Mrs. Walsh's hand. What happened next would change everything. The piece of chalk felt small and fragile between Raj's fingers. He stood facing the blackboard, aware of 26 pairs of eyes burning into his back. The classroom was so quiet he could hear the wall clock ticking and someone's nervous foot tapping against the floor. He took a deep breath, the chalky smell of the classroom filling his lungs. The equation Mrs. Walsh had written sprawled across the board like a challenge. It wasn't just complex, it was deliberately intimidating with nested functions and multiple variables that would confuse most college students. Mrs. Walsh stood a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest, a small satisfied smile playing at the corner of her mouth. She was certain she had finally put him in his place. "We're waiting, Raj," she said, glancing at her watch. "Though I understand if you need to admit this is beyond your capabilities." Someone coughed. Another student whispered something Raj couldn't catch. He heard a few uncomfortable shuffles, the sound of classmates who knew they were witnessing something cruel but felt powerless to stop it. Raj stared at the equation, and for a moment, the classroom around him faded away. The numbers and symbols weren't intimidating to him, they were like old friends. This particular type of problem had fascinated him last winter, during those long nights after his parents' funeral when sleep was impossible and math became his only escape. He lifted the chalk and began to write. His hand moved with surprising steadiness. First, he rearranged the equation, grouping terms in a way Mrs. Walsh hadn't taught them. Then he applied a substitution method, one he'd read about in an old college textbook he'd found at the public library. His writing was neat and his steps logical, each flowing naturally into the next. Behind him, the whispering stopped. Even Mrs. Walsh's breathing seemed to pause. As Raj continued, moving down the board to make space for his work, the atmosphere in the room shifted from awkward tension to stunned silence. After 3 minutes of continuous writing, Raj stepped back and underlined his answer twice. Then, almost as an afterthought, he moved to an empty section of the board and wrote alternative approach, before demonstrating a completely different method to arrive at the same result. When he finished the second solution, he carefully placed the chalk in the tray and turned around. The expressions he saw made his stomach tighten. Mrs. Walsh's face had drained of color, her earlier smugness replaced by confusion and disbelief. His classmates stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, some with open mouths, others with furrowed brows. Priya was grinning from ear to ear. That's not how I would approach it," Mrs. Walsh finally said, her voice smaller than Raj had ever heard it. "I know," Raj replied simply. The words came out clearer and stronger than he expected. "Your way works too. This is just faster." "Where did you learn this?" she asked, stepping closer to examine his work. Raj shrugged. "Books. The internet. Sometimes I just figure things out." The bell rang, making everyone jump. For a few seconds, nobody moved, the unusual spell of the moment still holding the class in place. Then, slowly, students began gathering their things, stealing glances at Raj and whispering to each other. "Class dismissed," Mrs. Walsh said automatically, though most students were already heading for the door. "Raj, stay behind, please." As the classroom emptied, Raj returned to his desk to collect his notebook. His heart was pounding, the momentary confidence fading as quickly as it had appeared. What would happen now? Would she accuse him of cheating? Call the principal? His grandmother couldn't handle any more problems. "Hey," Priya whispered as she passed his desk. That was incredible. She gave him a quick thumbs up before disappearing into the hallway with the others. When the last student had gone, Mrs. Walsh closed the classroom door and turned to face Raj. Her expression was unreadable, not angry exactly, but intense in a way that made him nervous. "How long?" she asked. "How long what? How long have you been able to do this level of mathematics?" Raj looked down at his worn sneakers. "Always, I guess. Numbers just make sense to me." Mrs. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, studying him with new eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its sharp edge. "You need to explain to me what's going on, Raj, because what I just saw doesn't match anything in your academic record. And I need to understand why." For the first time in over a year, someone was actually seeing him, really seeing him, not as a problem student or a statistic, but as a person with something valuable to offer. The feeling was so unexpected that Raj found himself blinking back tears. The wall he built around himself since the accident had a crack in it now. And through that crack, something that looked almost like hope began to seep through. The teacher's lounge was empty except for Mrs. Walsh, who sat hunched over a stack of folders. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows as afternoon turned to evening. She should have gone home hours ago, but after what happened in her classroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something important, something that had been right in front of her all along. Raj's student file lay open on the table. It was thinner than most, just a few pages of basic information, test scores, and teacher comments. Nothing in it explained what she had witnessed today. The boy had solved a college-level equation with an elegance that even she, with her mathematics degree, had to admire. Still here. It's almost 6. Mrs. Walsh looked up to see Mr. Chen, the school counselor, standing in the doorway with his coffee mug. "I'm trying to make sense of something," she said, gesturing to the file. "Do you know anything about this student, Raj Kumar?" Mr. Chen set down his coffee and peered at the file. The quiet one who was held back last year. Not much. He keeps to himself. Did you know he's some kind of math prodigy? Mr. Chen raised his eyebrows. No, his grades have been pretty average across the board. Why? Mrs. Walsh described what had happened in class that morning. As she spoke, Mr. Chen's expression changed from skeptical to concerned. I remember now, he said slowly. When he first transferred here, before the accident, there was some talk about advanced placement. But then his parents died, and everything fell apart for him. What accident? Mrs. Walsh asked, realizing how little she actually knew about Raj. Mr. Chen sat down across from her. Car crash, about 14 months ago. Both parents killed instantly. The grandmother became his guardian. I think that's why they moved to this district. She already had an apartment here. Mrs. Walsh felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She thought of all the times she'd called Raj out for being late, for looking tired, for not paying attention. Not once had she considered what might be happening in his life outside school. There might be something in his transfer records, Mr. Chen suggested. They should be in the main office. 30 minutes later, Mrs. Walsh sat alone again, this time with a dusty folder from Raj's previous school. What she found inside made her classroom behavior that morning seem even worse. 2 years ago, Raj had been tested for a gifted program. His scores were off the charts, especially in mathematical reasoning, where he had tested at a college sophomore level despite being only 14 at the time. There were recommendations for specialized programs, advanced placement, even early college courses. None of it had been implemented. A handwritten note was paper-clipped to the test results, follow-up pending parental discussion. The date on the note was 1 week before the accident. Mrs. Walsh pushed the papers away and covered her face with her hands. The system had failed this boy completely. His extraordinary gift had been buried under tragedy and bureaucratic oversight, and teachers like her had only made things worse by seeing what they expected to see. She reached for the phone and dialed the number listed as Raj's home contact. Hello. An elderly woman's voice answered, speaking with a slight accent. Mrs. Kumar. This is Elaine Walsh, Raj's math teacher. There was a pause. Has he done something wrong? The worry in the grandmother's voice made Mrs. Walsh's chest tighten. No, quite the opposite. I'm calling because I'd like to speak with you about Raj's abilities in mathematics. They're exceptional. Another pause. He has always been good with numbers, like his father. But since we lost them, he doesn't talk about such things anymore. Would it be possible for us to meet? Perhaps tomorrow after school? I cannot leave the apartment easily with my arthritis, and Raj works evenings at the grocery. He works every evening. Mrs. Walsh asked, thinking of the homework she assigned daily. 5 nights a week. We need the money for rent. Mrs. Walsh thought quickly. What if I came to you? I could visit your home tomorrow afternoon, before Raj's shift. The grandmother agreed, somewhat hesitantly, and gave directions to their apartment complex. After hanging up, Mrs. Walsh gathered the files and slipped them into her bag. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark with clouds. On her drive home, she couldn't stop thinking about the equation on the board and the quiet boy who had solved it without hesitation. She thought about the note in his file, unmotivated, and felt a surge of shame. How many other students had she misread? How many others had stories she'd never bothered to learn? At a red light, she pulled out her phone and sent an email to the district education coordinator, requesting information about mathematics competitions and scholarship opportunities. Then she called her husband. I'm going to be late for dinner, she said. I need to make a stop at the bookstore. Everything okay? He asked. Mrs. Walsh watched a family cross the street in front of her car, a mother, father, and young boy, holding hands and laughing together. The kind of simple moment Raj would never have again. No, she answered honestly. But I think maybe it could be. The apartment building stood between a laundromat and a discount furniture store, its brick exterior worn and faded. Mrs. Walsh checked the address on her phone again before climbing the concrete steps to the front entrance. A broken security buzzer hung from its wires, so she pulled open the door and stepped into a narrow hallway that smelled of cooking oil and floor cleaner. Apartment 2B was on the 2nd floor. Mrs. Walsh shifted the heavy bag on her shoulder as she knocked. Inside, she could hear slow, shuffling footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal a tiny woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Deep lines marked her face, but her eyes were bright and alert as she looked up at Mrs. Walsh. "Mrs. Kumar? I'm Elaine Walsh, Raj's math teacher. We spoke on the phone yesterday." The old woman nodded and stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please come in. Excuse our small home." The apartment was indeed small, just a living room connected to a kitchenette, with 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. But every surface was spotlessly clean, and colorful cushions brightened the worn furniture. Photos hung on the walls, many showing a younger Raj with a smiling couple that must have been his parents. "Raj is not home yet," Mrs. Kumar explained, gesturing for Mrs. Walsh to sit on the sofa. "He went to buy milk. He will be surprised to see his teacher here." Mrs. Walsh set her bag down. "I hope I'm not imposing. I wanted to talk to both of you about some opportunities for Raj." Mrs. Kumar lowered herself carefully into an armchair, her movements stiff with arthritis. "What kind of opportunities?" Mrs. Walsh was about to answer when the front door opened and Raj walked in, carrying a small grocery bag. He froze when he saw his teacher sitting in his living room. "Mrs. Walsh?" His voice was barely audible. "Hello, Raj. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I've been talking with your grandmother." Raj looked between the 2 women, confusion clear on his face. "Am I in trouble?" His grandmother clicked her tongue. "Why do you always think you are in trouble? Your teacher says you are good at math." "Very good." "That's right," Mrs. Walsh said, reaching into her bag. "In fact, based on what I saw yesterday, I think he might be more than just good. I think he might be exceptional." She pulled out several books, advanced mathematics texts she'd purchased the night before, and placed them on the coffee table. "I brought these for you. They go well beyond what we're covering in class." Raj approached slowly, as if the books might disappear if he moved too quickly. He picked one up, his fingers running gently over the cover before opening it to scan the pages. "Also," Mrs. Walsh continued, "I looked into some programs that might interest you. There's a statewide mathematics competition next month with scholarship prizes, and the community college offers advanced courses that high school students can take for dual credit." Mrs. Kumar leaned forward. "Scholarship for college?" "Potentially, yes. The prizes range from $5,000 to $20,000. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She said something to Raj in their native language, her voice breaking with emotion. Raj kept his eyes on the book in his hands. "We can't afford college," he said quietly. "I need to work after high school, to help with bills." Mrs. Walsh felt her throat tighten. "That's why these opportunities matter so much. With your abilities, Raj, you could qualify for substantial academic scholarships. Your education could be fully funded." She turned to Mrs. Kumar. "Your grandson solved an equation yesterday that most college students would struggle with. He did it elegantly, quickly, and in 2 different ways. I've been teaching for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Kumar nodded, unsurprised. His father was also good with numbers. He worked as an engineer before. She trailed off, glancing at the photos on the wall. Raj finally looked up. "Why are you doing this? Yesterday you thought I was just a problem student." The directness of his question caught Mrs. Walsh off guard. She deserved that. Taking a deep breath, she decided to be equally direct. "Because I was wrong about you, Raj. I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and I failed to see what was right in front of me. I'm sorry for that." She met his gaze steadily. "But more importantly, I'm doing this because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. You have a gift that could open doors not just for you, but potentially for others through the work you might do someday." For the first time since she'd known him, Raj's expression softened. He glanced at his grandmother, who was watching him with hope in her eyes. "What would I have to do for this competition?" he asked. Mrs. Walsh smiled. "First, we'd need to work together to prepare. I can meet with you during lunch periods or before school if that works better with your job schedule. The competition requires both written solutions and an oral presentation of your approach." She hesitated before adding, "It will take commitment, Raj, and it means letting people see what you can really do." The room fell quiet. Mrs. Kumar reached over and took her grandson's hand, saying something soft in their language. Raj nodded slowly, then straightened his shoulders. "I'll try," he said simply. Mrs. Walsh felt a surge of something like hope. It wasn't a passionate commitment, but from Raj, those two words meant everything. It was a crack in the wall he built, a willingness to step out of the shadows. As she left the apartment an hour later, after discussing details and signing preliminary forms, Mrs. Walsh realized she felt lighter than she had in months. Teaching had begun to feel routine to her, the days blending together in a parade of lesson plans and grading. But today reminded her why she'd become a teacher in the first place: to open doors, to find potential, to make a difference. Walking to her car, she sent a quick text to her husband. "Going to be late again tonight. Have a student who needs help catching up." Then she added, "Actually, I think he'll be the one helping me catch up." The school library was quiet in the early morning hours. Sunshine streamed through tall windows, casting warm rectangles of light across the wooden tables. At the far corner table, Raj hunched over a notebook, working through a series of complex problems while Mrs. Walsh watched. "That's an interesting approach," she said, pointing to his latest solution. "I've never seen anyone tackle it that way before." Raj shrugged, but the small smile that flickered across his face betrayed his pride. These early morning sessions had become a routine over the past 3 weeks. Every day at 6:30 a.m., before most teachers arrived, Raj would meet Mrs. Walsh in the library to prepare for the upcoming mathematics competition. "Try this one next," she said, sliding over a problem that had stumped her own college professors years ago. As Raj began working, Mrs. Walsh reflected on the changes she'd observed. The boy who once hid in the back row now carried himself differently. He still spoke softly, still kept to himself, but there was a new confidence in his eyes. A quiet acknowledgement of his own abilities. "Done," Raj said, pushing the notebook toward her. Mrs. Walsh checked his work, shaking her head in amazement. He'd found an elegant solution in less than 4 minutes. "You know, my professor spent an entire class period on this problem," she told him, "and your method is cleaner than the one in the textbook." Raj ducked his head, still uncomfortable with praise. "It just makes sense to me. Like seeing a clear path through a forest when everyone else is getting tangled in the branches." It was the most poetic thing she'd ever heard him say. The first bell rang, signaling 20 minutes until classes would start. Other students would begin arriving soon. "We should talk about your presentation for the competition," Mrs. Walsh said, gathering her papers. "Remember, it's not enough to solve the problems. You need to explain your thinking clearly." This was the part that worried Raj the most. Writing solutions came naturally, but standing in front of judges to explain his methods terrified him. "Could we practice after school today?" he asked. "I don't work until 6. "Of course. And I've been meaning to ask, has Mr. Patel at the grocery been flexible with your schedule?" Raj nodded. "After you talked to him, he changed my hours. I'm down to 3 nights a week now instead of 5. That had been one of Mrs. Walsh's first moves, calling Raj's employer to explain the situation. Mr. Patel, himself an immigrant who valued education, had immediately offered to adjust Raj's schedule to accommodate his competition preparation. Later that day, during lunch period, Raj sat at his usual corner table. But instead of eating alone, Prina joined him, along with 2 other students from the advanced math class. "How's the competition prep going?" asked Tao, a junior who had competed the previous year. "Pretty good," Raj said, still getting used to having actual conversations with classmates. "Mrs. Walsh thinks I have a real chance." "That's awesome," Pryor said, stealing one of his chips. "I heard she's been coming in super early just to work with you." Raj felt a pang of guilt. Mrs. Walsh was putting in so much time for him, rearranging her schedule, bringing him additional books and problems to solve. Yesterday, she'd even driven him home when it was raining heavily. "She's been really helpful," he admitted. "You should hear her in the teacher's lounge," said Kim, whose mother taught English at the school. "Mom says Mrs. Walsh talks about you like you're some kind of math rock star." Raj nearly choked on his sandwich. "She does." The others laughed at his surprise. The conversation shifted to other topics: weekend plans, a difficult biology test, a new movie everyone wanted to see. For the first time in over a year, Raj found himself participating in normal teenage social interaction. It felt strange, but not entirely unpleasant. After school, as promised, Mrs. Walsh helped Raj practice his presentation. They set up in her classroom, arranging chairs to simulate the competition layout. "Remember, you're not just showing the solution," she explained. "You're telling a story about how you approach the problem and why your method works." Raj took a deep breath and began explaining his solution to a particularly challenging topology problem. His voice was quiet at first, his eyes fixed on the floor. But as he delved into the mathematics, his tone grew stronger, his gestures more animated. Mrs. Walsh watched in amazement as the shy boy transformed before her eyes, becoming confident and articulate when discussing the subject he loved. "That was excellent," she said when he finished. "You just need to make eye contact with the judges occasionally." Raj nodded, making mental notes. "I'll practice with Nani tonight. She doesn't understand the math, but she can tell me if I'm looking up enough." Mrs. Walsh smiled at the mention of his grandmother, who had become an enthusiastic supporter of Raj's competition efforts. The elderly woman had even started learning basic math concepts so she could better appreciate her grandson's talent. As they packed up, the principal walked in. Mrs. Walsh had updated him on Raj's situation and the upcoming competition. "How are the preparations coming along?" he asked, his normally stern face softening as he addressed Raj directly. "Good, sir. I think I'm ready." The principal nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Walsh tells me your work is extraordinary. The whole school will be rooting for you next weekend." After he left, Raj turned to Mrs. Walsh with wide eyes. "The whole school?" "Well, word has gotten around," she said with a small smile. "People are impressed by what you're doing. The math department has even arranged a small bus to take interested students to watch the competition." Raj looked overwhelmed. 6 weeks ago, he had been invisible, just trying to get through each day unnoticed. Now people knew his name, teachers greeted him in the hallways, and classmates asked about his competition preparations. That evening, as Raj walked home, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the heavy weight of grief and responsibility pressing down on him. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar but not unwelcome, a sense of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. His grandmother was waiting at the apartment door when he arrived, her face alight with excitement. "A letter came for you," she said, holding out an envelope with a university logo. Raj took it with trembling hands. Whatever it contained, he knew his life had already changed in ways he never expected. From an overlooked student to someone with a future, all because one teacher had finally seen what others had missed. The university campus sprawled across carefully manicured lawns, its brick buildings imposing against the clear blue sky. Raj stood at the entrance to the mathematics building, his heart hammering in his chest. Around him, students from schools across the state chatted excitedly, many wearing team t-shirts with mathematical jokes printed on the back. "Nervous?" Mrs. Walsh asked, stopping beside him. She had driven Raj and his grandmother to the competition, insisting they ride with her rather than take the school bus with the other students. "A little," Raj admitted, gripping the folder containing his competition materials. That was an understatement. His stomach felt like it was tied in complicated knots, and a light sweat had broken out across his forehead despite the cool morning air. His grandmother patted his arm gently. Today she wore her best sari, the deep blue one with silver embroidery that she saved for special occasions. "You will do wonderfully," she said in her accented English. "Your parents would be so proud." The mention of his parents sent a bittersweet pang through Raj's chest. He wished they could see him today. His father, the engineer who had first shown him the beauty of numbers. His mother, who had always believed he would do extraordinary things. Mrs. Walsh checked her watch. "We should head inside. Registration closes in 15 minutes." The competition hall buzzed with activity. Tables had been set up around the room, each with a number and the name of a participating school. Raj spotted Priya Tao and several other classmates who had come to support him. They waved enthusiastically, holding up a handmade banner that read "Kumar is King of Calculus." Despite his nerves, Raj couldn't help smiling. He never expected to have friends cheering him on at a math competition. He never expected to be at a math competition at all. The first phase began at exactly 9:30 a.m. a written exam with 10 complex problems to be solved in 2 hours. As the proctor distributed the papers, Raj took a deep breath, remembering Mrs. Walsh's advice. Start with what you know. Trust your instincts. And remember, you've solved harder problems than these. When he flipped over his exam paper, the nervous energy that had been building inside him transformed into something else, a calm, focused clarity. The problems were challenging, yes, but they spoke a language he understood perfectly. As his pencil moved across the paper, the outside world faded away. There was only Raj and the mathematics, dancing together in perfect harmony. By the time the proctor called "pencils down," Raj had completed all 10 problems with 20 minutes to spare. He had even gone back to add alternative solutions to 2 of them, showing different approaches that might be considered more elegant. During the lunch break, Mrs. Walsh found him sitting under a tree, reviewing his notes for the afternoon's oral presentation. "How did the written portion go?" she asked, offering him a sandwich. "Good, I think. The topology problem was tricky, but I found a way through it." Mrs. Walsh smiled. She had seen the confidence in his posture when he walked out of the exam room, so different from the hunched shoulders of the boy who used to hide in the back of her classroom. The afternoon session took place in smaller rooms, with each contestant presenting their solution to a previously unseen problem before a panel of 3 judges. Raj's presentation was scheduled for 2:45 p.m. When his turn came, he stood before the judges, 2 university professors, and the head of the State Mathematics Association. They handed him a problem involving multivariable calculus and a real-world application in engineering. Raj had 15 minutes to develop a solution and prepare his presentation. As he worked through the problem, a strange thing happened. Instead of fear, he felt excitement bubbling up inside him. The problem was beautiful in its complexity, and finding the path to its solution felt like discovering treasure. When it was time to present, Raj approached the whiteboard with steady hands. His voice, once barely audible in class, filled the room as he explained his approach. The words flowed naturally, punctuated by clean, precise equations that appeared on the board as if they had always belonged there. "Remarkable," said one judge when Raj finished, leaning forward with interest. "You found a connection to fluid dynamics that I wouldn't have considered." "Can you elaborate on how you approached the initial setup?" asked another. "Your framing of the boundary conditions was unusual." For 10 minutes, they discussed Raj's solution, probing his understanding and exploring alternative approaches. Through it all, Raj responded thoughtfully, sometimes agreeing, sometimes respectfully suggesting different perspectives. It felt less like an examination and more like a conversation among equals, mathematicians sharing their passion for a beautiful problem. Later, as the sun began to set, contestants and spectators gathered in the main auditorium for the award ceremony. Raj sat between his grandmother and Mrs. Walsh, trying to manage his expectations. Making it this far had already exceeded anything he had imagined possible. The second-place award, with a scholarship of $15,000, announced the university president, goes to Raj Kumar from Oak Ridge High School. The auditorium erupted in cheers. Mrs. Walsh squeezed Raj's shoulder, her eyes shining with tears. His grandmother pressed her hands together in a gesture of thanks, whispering prayers in her native language. As Raj walked to the stage, legs slightly shaky, he spotted Priya jumping up and down in her seat, pointing at him with both hands. Other students from his school, students who had barely noticed him months ago, were on their feet, applauding wildly. The university president shook his hand and presented him with a certificate and medal. "Congratulations, young man. The judges were particularly impressed with your oral presentation. Have you considered where you might want to study after high school?" Raj thought of the letter that had arrived the evening before, an invitation to apply for the university's early admission program with a pre-approval for scholarship consideration. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm thinking about it carefully." 2 years later, Raj stood at a different podium, addressing the incoming freshman class at the same university where he had competed. Now a sophomore on a full scholarship, he had been asked to speak about his journey. 2 years ago, I was invisible, he told the sea of young faces before him. A kid who had lost his parents, who worked nights to help his grandmother pay rent, who had given up on the idea that education could change anything. He paused, remembering the moment in Mrs. Walsh's classroom when everything changed. Then a teacher challenged me. Not because she believed in me at first, but because she didn't. She put an equation on the board expecting me to fail. Instead, it opened a door I thought had been closed forever. In the audience, Mrs. Walsh listened with pride. She had driven 3 hours to hear Raj speak, bringing his grandmother with her. The two women had formed an unlikely friendship, united by their love for the young man who now confidently addressed hundreds of people. So when you face a challenge that seems impossible, Raj continued, when someone underestimates you or when life puts barriers in your way, remember this. Sometimes the equation that looks most difficult holds the solution to everything else. After the speech, as students and parents mingled at the reception, a young girl approached Raj shyly. "I'm not very good at math," she confessed, "but I want to be an engineer like my mom was before she got sick. Do you think I can do it?" Raj looked at her, seeing his own past uncertainty reflected in her eyes. He smiled and pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Let me show you something," he said, writing a simple equation. "This looks complicated at first glance, but if you approach it step by step, it reveals something beautiful, just like any challenge worth facing." As he guided her through the solution, Raj realized he had come full circle. From a student hiding his gifts to a mentor helping others discover theirs. From being forced to solve an equation as mockery to teaching equations as a path to possibility. Sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected teachers, and sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all.